November 1st, 2024, Novi Sad, Serbia. At the city's central train station, a concrete canopy collapses without warning. 16 people are killed, others are injured. In the hours and days that follow, the grief is real. But so is something else, the growing sense that this was not just an accident. But this is what corruption looks like when it meets concrete. What begins as vigils for the dead becomes, within weeks, one of the most sustained protest movements Europe has seen in years. Led initially by Gen Z students, it grows to include lawyers, farmers, taxi drivers, veterans, and hundreds of thousands of ordinary Serbians. This is the story of Serbia's civic awakening, and why, more than a year later, it still has not ended. Serbia is a nation of roughly 6.6 million people in southeastern Europe, a country that has spent the better part of 3 decades in the complicated process of democratic transition. This follows the collapse of Yugoslavia and the wars in the 1990s. About a quarter of its population is under the age of 24. Youth unemployment stands over 20%, among the highest in the region. Secondary education enrollment remains high, meaning Serbia has a highly educated young population with a diminished economic opportunity. Digital access is near universal, as nearly all Serbian youth have internet access. Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok each have millions of users in a country of 6.6 million, an extraordinarily high rate. And then there is the political context. Serbia ranks high in corruption rankings. President Alexander Vučić and his Serbian Progressive Party, known as the SNS, have dominated Serbian political life for over a decade. This dominance is associated by many, especially young Serbians, as the kind of institutional decay that turns a construction project into a death trap. The Novi Sad train station canopy had been renovated, contracts had been awarded, money had changed hands, and on November 1st, 2024, the structure collapsed, killing 16 people. Within days of the collapse, investigators made arrests. 11 people were charged in connection with the disaster, accused of criminal acts against public safety, irregular construction work, and causing public danger. But for many Serbians, the arrests were not reassurance, they were confirmation. The collapse was not bad luck. It was a product of a system which contracts are won through connections rather than competence, and where oversight is optional. Demonstrations began as vigils, quiet gatherings to honor the dead. But they became something more targeted as the investigation revealed the contours of what had gone wrong. On November 22nd, students and faculty at the Faculty of Dramatic Arts in Belgrade staged a blockade of their institution. They stopped traffic for exactly 16 minutes, 1 minute for each life lost. It was disciplined, symbolic, and deeply effective. During those protests, something happened that transformed the movement. A group of supporters of the SNS party physically attacked demonstrating students. The attack was documented and circulated on social media. The outrage it generated was immediate and enormous. The 16-minute traffic blockade, the tactic those students had been using when they were attacked, now spread across Serbia. Protesters, professionals, and ordinary citizens began stopping traffic for 16 minutes in cities and towns throughout the country. They called it Serbia Stop, and Serbia noticed. What made the Serbia movement distinctive, and what distinguished it from many other Gen Z protests in this series, was how quickly and how broadly it expanded beyond its starting point. By late November 2024 and into December, the protests had grown from student blockades into a genuinely cross-generational, cross-professional coalition. The Bar Association of Serbia announced lawyers would stop work for a week in solidarity for student protesters. They refused to enter courts, prosecutors' offices, or police buildings. That strike was then extended for a full month when the government failed to respond. Farmers drove their tractors into protest blockades alongside students. Taxi drivers gave protesters free rides across cities. Military veterans announced they would stand as a protective barrier between demonstrators and anyone who tried to attack them. A movement that had started with university students had become a mirror of Serbian civil society. In January 2025, Prime Minister Milos Vucevic resigned, attempting to relieve the pressure and signal openness to dialogue. It did not work. Protesters saw it as a partial concession that addressed none of their core demands: accountability, transparency, and structural reform to prevent another Novi Sad. President Vucevic had nominated an ally from within the SNS party to replace the prime minister. The protests continued. On December 22, 2024, tens of thousands, some estimates exceeding 100,000, gathered in Belgrade in one of the largest demonstrations Serbia had seen in years. That number would be surpassed on March 15th, 2025. The protest called 15th for 15, 15 days in a march for the 15 months of ongoing protests, drew what estimated to be at least 325,000 people in Belgrade alone. It was, by most accounts, the largest protest in Serbian history. Students, taxi drivers, farmers, lawyers, and veterans gathered throughout the city. The coalition that had been building for months had reached its peak visible size. Then came allegations that the government had used a sonic weapon to disperse the crowd. The claim, which the government denied, was not definitively proven, but several protesters filed a plea with the European Court of Human Rights. And the allegations deepened what was already a profound public distrust of the Serbian state's willingness to use force against its own citizens. The Serbian student protesters understood something that many movements do not. The domestic pressure alone may not be enough to move a government. So they took the protest to Europe. A group of student protesters organized a bike tour through several European cities. They rode through Budapest, Vienna, Munich, Ulm, and Strasbourg. In each city, they met with the mayor. In Strasbourg, they submitted a formal plea to the Council of Europe. They asked European institutions to pressure the Serbian government to, in their words, stand up for the rights of all of those who were forced to remain silent. They were received, they were listened to, and they came home. In April 2025, student protesters organized a multinational relay run, a route that crossed through Austria, Belgium, Croatia, France, Germany, and Luxembourg, ending in Brussels at the European Parliament. Members of the European Parliament met with the student runners. They listened to the concerns about the government transparency and corruption in Serbia, and those concerns were reflected in the formal language of a resolution that the European Parliament subsequently developed in Serbia. The document expressed support for the demonstrators and significant regret for President Vucevic's governance and his government's relationship with Russia. Back in Serbia, the government's response to the international pressure was to escalate its domestic crackdown. Officials labeled protesters terrorists. They published sensitive personal information about demonstrators in a public smear campaign. Police detained dozens of protesters on a single day in July. Reports emerged of police standing by while mass SNS supporters attacked demonstrators. Videos of officers beating protesters circulated online. In October 2025, the European Parliament adopted a formal resolution condemning the Serbian government's use of force against protesters. The protesters had taken their case to the highest institutional levels available to them, and the government's response was to keep arresting people. On November 1st, 2025, exactly 1 year after the canopy collapse, over 100,000 people gathered in Novi Sad. Not in rage, in memory. The mother of one of the victims held a hunger strike that lasted more than 2 weeks. 400,000 Serbians signed a petition calling for early elections. Student protesters announced plans to continue rallying into 2026. Serbia's movement offers a different kind of case study than Bangladesh or Nepal, where a government fell, or Kenya, where a bill was withdrawn. In Serbia, the core demand of the movement, accountability for Novi Sad and the removal of President Vucevic, has not been met as of early 2026. Vucevic remains in office. Early elections have not been called. What Serbia shows us is the question that haunts every sustained protest movement. What happens when a government has both the will and the capacity to simply wait you out? The Serbian movement has remained large, organized, and creative longer than almost any comparable movement in this video series. It was built on an international coalition. It has generated formal European condemnation of the government. And yet, Vucevic holds on. The protesters are still in the streets. The outcome, as of early 2026, remains unwritten. The Serbian protest movement began with 16 deaths and a question about concrete. It became a question about democracy, about whether citizens in a country with a powerful, entrenched government can force accountability through sustained, nonviolent resistance. That question has no clean answer yet. But the fact that hundreds of thousands of Serbians are still asking it, still showing up, still running across borders to deliver letters to parliaments, that itself is the story. Sometimes, the most important thing a movement can do is refuse to disappear. Thanks for watching. Explore the full Revolution Will Be Digitized series and our interactive map of global ginseng movements at the Aspirations Network link in the video description. If you enjoyed this episode, like and subscribe for future releases.